Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. We're continuing our series, Misunderstood Quranic Verses, and with me is Dr. Shabir. Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
This misunderstood Quranic verse is from chapter 2, verse 106. It says, "Any verse we cause to be abrogated or forgotten, we will replace it with one like it. Do you not know that God has power over all things?" So maybe you can explain the verse a little bit to us, Dr. Jabir, and tell us what has been misunderstood.
So the verse in Arabic, Safi, reads, as you know very well, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا نَأْتِ بِخَيْرٍ مِنْهَا أَوْ مِثْلِهَا أَلَمْ تَعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. Whatever a verse, I say verse here, the Arabic word is ayah, which means something like could be a sign, it could be something in the heavens and the earth that points towards God. But in this context, it looks to be a verse from Scripture.
Okay.
And it is not necessarily the Quranic scripture. It could be a pre-Quranic scripture that, the verses can also be called ayat. For example, in another passage in the 3rd chapter of the Quran, it says about the people of the book, who are most likely Jews or Christians, يَتْلُونَ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ آنَاءَ اللَّيْلِ وَهُمْ يَسْجُدُونَ. They recite the ayat of Allah, which probably means the verses of the scripture before the Quran, and they prostrate. They recite it, day and night, and they prostrate. In other words, the Quran is praising those people who were reciting the scripture and responding to God positively as a result of their recitations. So coming back to the Quranic verse, Surah 2, verse 106, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا. Whatever ayah we cause to be abrogated or to be forgotten, نَأْتِ بِخَيْرٍ مِنْهَا أَوْ مِثْلِهَا. We bring something better than it, or at least similar to it. أَلَمْ تَعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. Do you not know that Allah is able to do all things? Now, the classical commentators on the Quran have taken this verse to mean that some verses of the Quran abrogate some other verses. And the word
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, abrogate is a legal term, and lawyers will know the term right away because it's used all the time in law. But in everyday language, who says who says something abrogates another one? People are more familiar with repeal. A law is repealed, which means that a law is published, and for some reason later on the law is changed. That old law is taken away, a new law comes into vogue or into effect. So something like this is what the classical commentators understood, that the Quran might have given a rule for one time, and then circumstances change, and then God gives another rule for a later time, and then it's the last rule that remains binding for people. But the classical commentators also went into very complicated scenarios regarding this. One scenario is that there are two verses in the Quran, one earlier, one later. It is only the later one that takes effect. The previous one is considered to be abrogated, which leaves Muslims with the strangeness that you come to a verse and you cannot be sure, is this abrogated or not? You have to check with the scholars. You can't let God speak to you directly here unless you get the scholars to explain to you what has been abrogated and what has not been, and so on. And then they said also that there could be a verse of the Quran whose recitation is abrogated. So the verse is no longer there in the Quran, but it still applies. So the effect of still is there. Whatever legal ruling it gave still applies. So Muslims may have to do something, and they have to consider that to be like a revelation from God that causes them to do this, but it's not there as part of the Quran. So you see, it gets very complicated.
Yes.
Yeah. Within the context, then, looking at this passage, it becomes very clear that this passage is not talking about a verse of the Quran abrogating another verse. It seems within the context that it is referring to the Quran coming to abrogate the previous revelations, which is a very common Muslim belief as well. Within the context, you see that Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the chapter we're dealing with, the 2nd chapter of the Quran, very early on talks about the creation of the heavens and the earth, the creation of Adam and his spouse, their dwelling in the garden, and so on. The story of the fall as comparable with the book of Genesis in the Bible. And then the Israelite history of God revealing the Quran, revealing the previous scriptures to Moses and Jesus, getting the gospel and so on. And then we come to this verse which says that God is repealing some obviously some previous revelation. And this sets the stage for God to now introduce the Quranic legislation. So when we come to verse number, this is 106 we're dealing with. When we come later on to verse number 142, we see that a whole new body of legislation is being introduced with the change of Qibla, the direction in which Muslims are going to pray. Whereas previously people were praying towards the Masjid Al-Aqsa, or at least the Temple Mount, which existed at the time, though the building, the mosque that is called Masjid Al-Aqsa was not built yet. And people are facing to what they consider to be the Jerusalem temple, or at least what remains of the Temple Mount. And now the Quran is giving a shift, a new direction. And with that comes laws, food laws, for example, laws about marriage and divorce, or laws about financial transactions, like, the prohibition against taking interest, and so on. So the Quran is now setting the stage by saying in verse number 106 of our present verse of discussion that, yes, some of the previous laws are going to be repealed, though they were there in a previous scripture. They are, in verses from God. But you should not be too concerned about that, because this is God's way of doing things. Whatever God repeals of a previous revelation, he's going to bring one better than it, or at least similar to it. So you have nothing to worry about. You don't lose anything. With this understanding, we do not need to pin the Quran onto a belief that in that complicated system that the scholars had worked out, saying this verse abrogates the other verse. You can't really know if the verse really should be applied to you today without first checking with the scholars. And by the way, the scholars sometimes are not agreed on which verse abrogates which other verse as well. And you don't have to imagine that there are some verses of the Quran that were once revealed, but that have been taken out of the Quran altogether, such that their ruling still applies, And they mentioned even a third category, that some have been so taken out altogether that even the ruling no longer applies, which is, in a way, it doesn't bother anyone, because it's gone forever, right? It's the one that is no longer in the Quran, but its ruling still applies, seems strange. Why would God reveal a message, take it out of his book, but still insist that it should be followed? And then why would he leave a verse in the book and not want you to follow it? So the correction of that misunderstanding, I think, will go a far way, and we will see there are many passages in the Quran which have been regarded as being abrogated by other passages, and that renders much of the Quran impotent. The Quran's verses are there, but cannot really speak to us. We just read them for blessings, but we pass over them, not, daring to follow the prescriptions that are therein.
Are there any translators or commentators on the Quran who recognize that there was, this abrogation didn't refer to abrogation within the Quran itself, but referred to previous revelation?
Yes. Safi Kaskas, for example, he has put in parentheses that, whatever verse of a previous revelation we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or similar to it. So that's one example. And there are many. In fact, Dr. Taha Jabir Al-Alwani, who was president of IIIT, International Institute of Islamic Thought in the United States, may God have mercy on him, on his soul, he actually gave a long lecture about this, and he wrote about this problem of abrogation, and many others have recognized it in modern times, that it was a convenient strategy that was used by scholars in the past when they saw that two verses of the Quran are in some tension with each other. One way of resolving the tension was to say, well, one has been abrogated. But today we would say, no, it's not that one has been abrogated. It's more so that one is speaking more specifically, whereas the other one is speaking more generally. So they both apply. or they apply in different circumstances, and you have to see which circumstance requires which one, and the circumstances could change, and this one could apply in one circumstance, and this other one could apply in another circumstance. You just have to do a little bit of a brain work to see which applies to which, but they all apply in some way, and this will remain with us as the final book from God, with all of it being in effect for further circumstances to which they are intended.
And we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Media Hub, the new home of Let the Quran Speak.
Here we spread positivity and good. We help people experience the beauty of Islam and help them appreciate and understand Muslims.
This beautiful building we purchased at cost $2.3 million.
Yeah, we've already raised a third of that money, and with your help, inshallah, we can pay off the rest.
So we're looking for people who can give $1,000 each. If you can be part of the select group, that's amazing.
Otherwise, just please give whatever you can. Every dollar counts.
It's our collective responsibility to share the message of Islam with our fellow human beings. Please help us continue this good work.
It's a sadaqah jariyah, something that will continue to be a benefit to the Muslim community long after Safi and I are gone.
Please support our work at muslimmediahub.com.
Your support is zakat eligible and tax deductible.
May Allah bless you and your loved ones today and always. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.